Morning. Welcome back to Catch Up with Chuck, this broadcast that we do from the Rural Futures Institute at the University of Nebraska. I'm Chuck Schroeder. I'm the founding executive director of the Rural Futures Institute. And for those of you that have watched some of our materials, you know that our goal is a thriving, high-touch, high-tech future for rural Nebraska and the Great Plains by 2040. Well, we know that in order to achieve that goal, rural communities have to be a fertile seedbed for business and social entrepreneurs that are in the business of driving positive change in their communities. So joining me today in this first broadcast of 2018 is our friend, a leading entrepreneur and genuine agent of change in rural America, Brent Comstock. Brent is the founding CEO of BCom Solutions, which was originated in Auburn, Nebraska. Now have an office here in Lincoln, but still rooted in Auburn. But he is now also the founder of the Rural Impact Hub, which is a nonprofit organization working in partnership with BCom to create a national platform for action and collaboration among rural activists. I love that statement. I always
we
think
do
of,
marketing.
Old fish shakers. I just love them. So Brent, welcome.
Thank you.
We're
Thanks for
delighted
having
to
me.
have you as part of our program. Well, listen, you've been ginning up and acting on ideas for rural-based businesses for a long time. Now, you've said yourself you look 12, even though you're 22,
Maybe
but you're
13.
pretty young.
Yeah.
But you've been doing this for a long time. Tell us a little bit about your history.
Yeah. So I grew up in Auburn, Nebraska, and ended up the short geographic pieces. I've lived in Auburn, I've lived on the East Coast for college, and then I came back about a little over half a year ago. And while all that was going on, I was building BCom Solutions, which originally started as your neighborhood computer repair store, which has now evolved into a leading digital agency that works with political candidates, capital campaigns, advocacy issues. But also, while doing BCom Solutions and building that, we recognized a value in providing services to rural communities. And so as our company grew and we expanded offices, we have an office in Lincoln here and one in Auburn as well now still. As we continue to grow, we recognize the need to have some sort of system, some sort of model that could be replicable so that other rural communities could have things like entrepreneurial activities and ecosystems that help facilitate change. And so we built the Rural Impact Hub about a year ago to do just that. And so I split my time between those, and in my spare time, I dabble in venture capital in the Baltic region of Europe, which is not all that dissimilar from rural Nebraska.
Sure.
I'm 22.
Well, listen, okay, speaking of your youth, the legend is that you started your first business at age 12. Now listen, you may have been a computer whiz kid, but there had to be more to it. And we think a lot about people and relationships in our work with the Rural Futures Institute. Talk a little bit about the family environment at the Comstock house that encouraged a 12-year-old to start his own business and feel like you could do that.
Sure. So my parents, my dad is an entrepreneur and my mom works with him. They own a plumbing and heating business. And I think the most important thing was a work ethic that was instilled from kind of very early on. My parents, built their own business and grew it to be successful. And this idea that you have to work to get and achieve success was really important. But I think the bigger thing, which I learned after going to college and having some friends that didn't have the same environment growing up, was learning and understanding that my parents told me and my extended family told me from early on that you can achieve what you want, but you've got to work towards it. Whereas a lot of parents tend to maybe be a little bit more of helicopters and say, you need to go into this career or that career. My parents were happy to have me do what I wanted, just knowing that it was my responsibility. And as I was growing into an adult, that was important. And now that I look back on that, that's really been important to be able to have that freedom. Our business started in my parents' basement. Actually, it wasn't even the basement. My first business was before 12, and I would sell magazines, rent magazines out that I didn't own to family members, and then I would find them if they were overdue. But that business took place under the stairs. It was like the Harry Potter cupboard. Then we upgraded to the storage room, and then the technology business took off, and then we built our office in Auburn and continued to grow. But that supportive environment, I think, is critical for people in entrepreneurship or in other industries too.
Anything else they want to do in life.
Yeah.
It just established such a great pattern in you that it's been fun for me to see you replicate, use those same tools personally in so many different ways. Okay, so you may have been working in the basement for a bit, but one of the interesting parts about your story to me is as your business started growing, you chose not to just do it in your garage or your basement and focus on what's great for Brent and for my business.
Yeah.
You very early on said, hey, what could we do on the main street of Auburn, Nebraska that would not only help our business grow, but from as best I remember the story, as we came down for the opening, when you opened the doors, it was immediately available to the community for other activities that were good for other people.
Yeah.
Tell a little bit about your relationship to community.
Yeah. Well, when I went away to school in North Carolina 4.5 years ago, I didn't have any explicit intention of coming back. Which people now, even saying that, it sounds kind of entertaining and funny that I had a completely different plan that involved Washington, D.C. and all these other things, which are still coming to fruition in a different context. But I had every intention of going to the university that had offered me a full ride, and I was going to stay there, and I was going to grow that. And then I came back, I came home for a break, and several businesses had pulled their businesses out of downtown. And so in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where people are fighting to get real estate space, in Auburn, Nebraska, people were, you could rent a whole block. And so that was the original reason why I started talking about this idea that Main Street businesses, they need to evolve, and organizations, they need to evolve to be able to adapt with the times, but at the same time, that value of a Main Street business, presence is so important. Whether it's digital presence, but in rural communities, that physical presence, which we tried to tell people did not mean you needed to have your own building, but hey, come and rent this table and use this table as your space, and then when you're done with it, you leave. And that mindset of thinking is not new to the world. We weren't inventing anything, but for rural communities, that the adaptation and the business and the kind of the downtown mentality was very different.
Sure. That
was new, and it's still a challenge and a struggle. People go, oh, so we can come in here and use this space, and like, what's the catch? And I was like, well, you tell people that you used it, so more people can use it. That's strange, but it's growing, and I think the Rural Impact Hub, the layer on top of that we added in the last 4 years was place is important, presence is important, people are important, but also programming. If you want to make change, you can't just expect to have an empty room and people to come do it. So we've facilitated workshops. We're inviting national politicians to come in this year, since it's an election year, and have civil debates in our space, because politicians and groups of people and thought leaders and academics, they think about rural America. They talk about it. Some of them write about it, but not a lot of times are people talking it in rural America. Yeah. So they're on Main Street, Auburn, Nebraska, population 3,400, and they're experiencing that firsthand.
Well, this whole notion of high touch and high tech, again, not a new idea, but it's one that we see over and over as critical to success, and you demonstrate that. So we talk a lot about rural broadband, and it's a big issue nationally. You and I have talked about it. You've been in the middle of all that. So, but to launch BCom Solutions in Auburn, you had to have access to high quality broadband.
Or broadband.
Or broadband of some kind. So just briefly, we're gonna explore this in more depth in weeks to come. But from your standpoint as a business person, was it just a matter of getting fiber to the door, or is it a more complex issue for a for the business
Yeah.
and the community.
So interestingly enough, there is not rural broadband. I think is critical. That access is critical. And the thing that I tell people, I think a lot of times people think about fiber or internet, and they think about Netflix, and they think about all the things that Facebook and Snapchat. And I go to rural communities and meet with people that are 80 and 90 years old, and they go, "Well, my great grandkids, all they're doing is got their face in their phone." And rural broadband is surely helping support that, but from my perspective, without access to the internet, I wouldn't be sitting here today, because I would, go to college and get a degree and go get a job somewhere. I wouldn't have had the ability to build a technology company in Auburn, Nebraska before I could drive a car. But in Auburn, we didn't have a local provider, which I think is really key when you have those local community partners like a telephone company that's evolved into the fiber company. And so that was really critical, and I think that access provides people with an opportunity. And similar to what you talked about, kind of that high-touch mentality, having it is one thing, but then being able to say, okay, we have it, now we can build all these programs off of it is another thing. When we look at the Rural Impact Hub in a scalability model, it's going to every rural broadband company or affiliate and saying, here, use this, so that way when you want to take part in our programming, you can tune in through a video. You don't have to drive 600 miles to get to us. We'd welcome you to. But that access, I think, is critical, and I think it's important as generations kind of change that message hasn't been lost.
Listen, I want to explore in a little more depth something that you've referenced a couple of times here. So here you have BCom Solutions that you started as a kid. It's grown, it's been successful. You're involved in a number of countries internationally now. You've gotten into other realms, politics, as you've referenced here, and crossing the spectrum of ideological positions and all that sort of thing.
That's a whole other episode.
So how, a rational person would say, okay, you've got this booming business. You could focus all of your attention and your energies right there, what most people would do. Well, instead, in 2017, you launch this nonprofit, Rural Impact Hub, that, I mean, it may help BCom Solutions, but you wouldn't have done it for just that purpose.
Right.
What the heck are you doing? It seems to me, there's quite honestly, there's a values underpinning here that I want to explore for just a minute.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the key things, some days it's, BCom Solutions is if I work on the Rural Impact Hub enough, then BCom Solutions becomes the nonprofit. I won't tell anyone on our team that, but so there is a underlying value, and that was, as our business has grown, we've struggled with how do we remain in touch and connection with rural communities. And when I moved back, the assumption was that I would centralize all of my attention to one rural community. And I've traveled to hundreds of rural communities and spoken to thousands of people from Alaska to Florida and everywhere in between, and every time I see great opportunities and things going on, but it's usually someone gets tied down to that community, and then they can't share, they can't spread their ideas, and then they get kind of brain drain. And so it's like, we need to build a model that's scalable or replicable. We try and use the word replicable because we want each community to be able to pick it off and use it as their own, not to think of it as this big corporation that's expanding, because it's not. And at the same time, rural entrepreneurship is important. I am, probably the strongest advocate for building rural entrepreneurship from an early age. But there are also some underlying issues that entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs have to face when they work in a rural community. Not really any different from urban communities, but racism is still alive in rural communities. Sexism is still alive in communities. The idea of identity in a rural community, people have this identity crisis of, I'm 3 hours from the nearest thing. A small business planning workshop is not necessarily going to help them first, but helping them identify like-minded people will. And that's not a political issue, that's not a gender issue. That's just an issue of some people are in a rural community because that's where they came from, that's where they're going to stay, and they're consistent and they're happy with working their job. Some people are living in this rural community saying there's so many opportunities, but they feel like they don't have that body to support them.
Sure.
And that directly helps BCom Solutions, because we are working to be the digital resource for rural politicians, rural nonprofits, and capital campaigns. And so when people say, well, what services do you bring? It's like, here's all the digital resources. And not only do we sell those technology services, but we understand the place that you're working in because we're spending every day in some way being involved and in some capacity. The final thing on that is the rural-urban divide, which I think is largely this misnomer that people, you exit Lincoln and then you go to this big wall and then you open the gate and then, oh, there's rural, you've arrived. Like, that doesn't happen. But people talk about it as if it's this mysterious thing. And so one of the things that we're working with in the Rural Impact Hub is how do urbanites and residents and urban communities still stay in touch with rural communities? And that's been a challenge for me as someone who has residence in Lincoln, spends time in a lot of rural communities, largely in Auburn too, but how do people still accept me as someone who's from a rural community and that I'm not selling out? Right. But that there are hybrid models, because my philosophy is if there's a business owner who would like to invest in a rural community $10-20 million, but he or she wants to stay living in Omaha or Kearney, or why wouldn't that rural community say, oh, well, we're happy, bring the business in, let's find a model to make you involved and engaged, because that supports the economy of that community and it supports the business owner in wanting to continue to be involved. And that rural-urban divide, I think, is something that people will constantly talk about. Politicians talk about it, right. Businesses talk about it, nonprofits talk about it, and that's something that we're trying to always talk about, that the divide is the issue. It's not we need to separate rural and urban into two buckets.
Well, it's what I just have loved about the concept since the time you launched it, is that it does create an opportunity for crossing that divide, but also for those entrepreneurs, civic leaders in rural communities who, as you say, they want to be connected with like-minded people, like different interests that can help spark them, and sometimes that's hard. It's a little bit of the philosophy that we've applied in our sponsorship of Connecting Young Nebraskans and connecting young professionals across the state who can sometimes feel kind of isolated, and it's just amazing what happens when you cross that high-touch divide and get people together. So, okay, let me jump a little bit. In our program last week, we had Kathy Lang, who is the new director of the Nebraska Business Development Center, which is based at the University of Nebraska. Kathy and her organization have a statewide mission to encourage small business development. In your adventures, you've worked with local, state, federal agencies that are kind of in this game. What advice would you have for them for doing things that actually matter for you, the small business guy who's trying to make something happen in a rural community?
Well, I think this is really funny because I just got done sending an email to someone in DC talking about the impracticalities of grant programs that are built for rural businesses that 90% of them don't qualify for because they don't meet the minimum revenue threshold, or they don't meet all these different requirements. I think the biggest advice is the simple fact that rural communities are unique. They're not cities, so the same model shouldn't be adopted. And so what usually happens is people take an urban program and they go, this is something we could scale to every rural community. Well, sure, but without changing the requirements, nothing's ever gonna happen. The other challenge is that there is this, and I don't think it's just urban or in rural, but I think it's everywhere. But in rural communities, we call the city slickers the city slickers for a reason, because typically they come in, they talk, and then they leave. And so when these programs come in, number one, most people don't know about them.
Sure.
There's marketing, number one, and number two, the idea of building a relationship, a federal program or a state program or a local program, I consider it community organizing. And if you don't do the organizing piece, which is why we love working in the political space too, because it's the same mindset, you've got to build that relationship, you've got to understand the people, and you've got to show that you're actually invested and interested in it, or they're going to think, we've survived without your money, we don't need it, or your assistance, or whatever it may be. The marketing thing is a whole other challenge. Local newspapers are still a thing, so if you want to target people that are 50 plus, hit the local newspapers. But social media and the targeting capabilities is so much better. We have people reaching out to us on a regular basis saying, we noticed that you targeted rural communities for XYZ reasons. And people think that these residents in Scotts Bluff or in Benkelman or way out west, they think that they're isolated. Well, yeah, they're isolated, but they're looking at their phone.
Sure.
So why would you advertise in the newspaper that they don't know exists instead of targeting those rural using social media? And so with those programs and with politicians, I've told our team several times, like a dream customer of ours would be either a local candidate that wants to use digital to get elected, or a federal race like a presidential race that we're in no capacity to service their entire digital operation, but they come to us and they say, rural audiences, which we do. And I think that's really important from a marketing perspective, is that there are people there that are waiting for these programs. There are people there that wait until after it's too late. But I think they exist, and I think that's really challenging, is that there are many generations in rural communities, and so the marketing strategy cannot be any different than in the city.
Sure.
Your target audience is just going to be a little bit
A
smaller.
little smaller. Sure,
Yeah.
of course. Okay, listen, we know that we have folks in our audiences, moms and dads, prospective students that are watching Brent Comstock today and thinking about your success, and I'll just bet they're saying to themselves, okay, for my education track, I'm going to have to focus exclusively on business, information technology courses. That's going to be the key to my success. I know a little bit about the track that you have followed, and that is not it.
Yeah.
I want you to share with our audience a bit of the diversity of your interests, and that you
Sure.
included in your academic track.
Yeah. Well, I think so I took classes in college ranging from accounting to mergers and acquisitions to Arabic to understanding Christianity's role in a non-religious government affiliation, and I mean all of these different things. And people probably were looking at this thing, what in the world is going on? I can't remember what the most obscure. I took swimming, of course, too, because that was the easiest physical education class. So amongst all of those, I have two programs of study in business and in religious studies, which has been so fascinating because I came from, predominantly white, conservative, Christian America. And this diversity piece was also something that the diversity of the mind I think is really important. Right. And so I tell people all the time, number one, you have to take a religious studies class. Most of the people in my religious studies program were not religious, which a lot of the people from back home are like, oh, religious studies, you're going to be a pastor. And then I said business, and they said, oh, you're going to be a church treasurer. And well, if this doesn't work, then I'll just move right on down the road. But when you understand someone's religion, or when you understand the way, and religion is largely culture, when you understand that, as a business person, I'm more well equipped to go into, Saudi Arabia or to Italy or to a different country, not because I can value a business and know mergers and acquisitions and know how to do that. That's important. But to get and to facilitate that relationship is all about, you don't schedule times during prayer time in Dubai or doing all these different pieces. And I wouldn't have that if I just did the business major or I just did the computer science program. Which doesn't mean, and the major, we're hiring, by the way, if you're a current student, this is relevant, and we have internships, and they're paid, but I don't think I've ever looked at someone's major or asked. We have an agronomist as our digital director at our company, who got an undergrad and grad degree at this institution, and it's like, well, that's a natural, path, of course, going from East Campus in agronomy to working at a web design company. Perfect. We're not weird or anything, but that doesn't matter. And I think that's really important. It's hard for the institutional knowledge to kind of evolve into that, but I've never looked at someone's area of study. Now, when it's unique, I ask them about it. Sure. If they list a language, I Google the first 3 or 4 phrases you should know, and then I test them on it. But I think that's really important, is studying what you're interested in, because the degree is important. I fundamentally believe that, and the networking opportunities are even more incredible. I'm fascinated with alumni bases and how there's so many untapped opportunities in alumni bases. And the mentors that I've had, and I tell people, We hired people, had customers, had 2 offices, won awards, including a congressional award for rural economic development before I had a college degree. There was something involved in the equation that wasn't just academics and higher education, and that was largely mentors, many of which came from going to college. So I think that's really important. And if you're a prospective student, I would look at the campus environment. I look at the educational program, because if you want to study medicine and they don't have a good pre-med or there are some industries
Sure.
where it's out of the blue, but if you those mentorships are really important. And you can understand from meeting with a professor, you can understand from meeting with an administrator if that's going to be the right fit. And actually, I remember an example of that. One of my mentors early on was Connie. And Connie was, trying to advocate for me to come to UNL. I did not. But I remember she said, well, we're going to come up for a day and we're going to spend a day at UNL. And we came here, and I was like, Connie, I don't have any interest in agriculture, which is really funny now because we're working with agriculture institutions and organizations, and I'm like, well, this would have been nice to know. We're comparing, notes about associations that involve pork and cattle and all this, but we came here, we looked at the angler program, we looked at, I met with now Chancellor Green, who at the time was the Vice Chancellor, and we went to all these different programs, and I think immediately after that day, I decided I wasn't going here. It had nothing to really do with the experience, but I knew that I had people here that I could lean on for support, and that's something that's invaluable. And it doesn't matter the institution. I went to school on the East Coast and come back, and those relationships are still active.
Sure.
And that was a big deal, and that was something that I really leaned on when I looked at colleges was what will be my support base wherever I go.
Yeah, I want to throw in here. You also have a deep interest in music.
Oh yeah, that's the other. That's the fifth
which
thing.
actually I'm gonna roll into our next question. You and I share.
You're gonna roll the piano out and move it in.
We could. It would make the point. You and I share a fascination with the role of elders in various cultures and society. Now, most people look at Brent Comstock and see this classic 22-year-old millennial. However, I have heard you say happily, sometimes I act like an 80-year-old.
Yeah.
I want you to say a little bit, we've had some great conversations along this line. I want you to say a little bit about the influence of elders in your life. And I know that at a very early stage you were performing music for elders for their entertainment. But the role of elders, and you have some thoughts about their role in entrepreneurial companies.
Yeah. Well, I love old people. We'll just put that out there now. And I am fascinated with intergenerational kind of connections and opportunities. Obviously, growing up in a rural community, there's a lot of elderly people, elders to young people, but also people that are elderly. And my earliest business customers were 85, and that's not an exaggeration, year-old ladies that my mom knew from aerobics or that my parents and I saw at church. And I just think there's a historical piece there that I spend all day in technology. So we could completely change our business model. We try not to, but tomorrow. And it wouldn't be that uncommon. But something that you lose in a startup or in a technology company, or being the CEO of a company at 22, I could be 22 and have a PhD, but I still don't have that experience. And I think a lot of times people try, and again, kind of like the rural-urban divide, it's like the old-young divide, and they try and separate those groups. And I learned from playing piano recitals for people at a nursing home, to interacting with people at church, to then working for them, to then going to college and realizing that a lot of my friends were 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. Our oldest customer, I think, was like 96 or 97. And that's been really fundamental to me as a person. And that role of elders, and in my capacity, and mentors, I love hearing stories. I love to talk if that hasn't been established. And you learn so many different things. And we talked about this when we were talking about the arts and visual arts and performing arts. And I've been in every capacity from performing. I would go in the summer to Iowa, and I would play a little tour of nursing homes, and I got everything from a tip in a tip jar to one lady telling me that her granddaughter was my age and was single and available, which, you know, there's a catch, but it was just so interesting to meet and connect with people, and it's something that it's also a stress reliever. You know, this doing all the things that we've talked about is certainly not easy. I wouldn't say that it's rocket science. It takes a lot of manual. You have to do things, and I think that's, if anything, people look at all the different things that I'm doing and our company's doing, and they see all the kind of disconnected in some ways. But we're not in the business of spending a lot of time on research and study, which is not anything wrong with it. But we're not an academic institution. We have to survive and do things. And that's something that music has been kind of a release for me as well, and that, whether that's singing in a church choir, playing the pipe organ, or playing the piano, and it follows me everywhere. When I went to North Carolina, I walked into church at a church I was going to, and had asked if they needed, you know, an accompanist for some sort of ensemble, and I ended up spending 4 years accompanying the children's choirs at this church. There were two that I accompanied, and when I wasn't accompanying the church choir, the children's choirs, I was sitting in the back of the church on Sundays with a man who was probably 50 to 60 years older than I was, who became one of my best friends. And my roommates were like, "Oh, Brent's going to hang out with Bill again. That's odd." And so it's all interconnected. But I mean, I've learned so many different things. And I think it's great for our business. So the next thing I'm going to try and roll out is a elders internship program, because once you retire, people are like, well, you know, I'm going to go work at Walmart, or, which I don't think there's anything wrong with, but I think there's so many different ways that you can get elders involved in giving their expertise and mindset in a business that they have no idea what's going on, and we have no idea what they've done in life. I haven't shared that with my team yet, so we'll tag that note, and I'll send that clip right on to them. But it's been important, and it still is, and I hope that, and I'm trying to do this now, even when, you know, I see people there are a couple of people I know that are freshmen in college that they're having difficulty navigating the situation. They're trying to understand that. I have a lot of friends who maybe don't align with me politically, who know, though, that I have some sort of connection, or I have knowledge about a political subject that they're trying to understand, and they'll reach out to me. And I think that fostering of mentorship is important regardless of age, but you obviously get a lot of cool stories when you meet with someone who's been through 2 world wars, and, you know, it's really fascinating.
Well, listen, I made a funny face a bit ago because I know we've run way long.
We've lost our viewership, and
but this
tonight on TV,
here we go. Well, Brent, this has been such a treat. You're a change maker with strong Nebraska roots. Your ventures have had global impact. We're so proud to have you as a friend of the Rural Futures Institute, and I hope as time goes on we can continue to engage in big ideas. This has been great fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, listen, I'm going to ask you to stay in touch with the Rural Futures Institute through Facebook and Twitter, as well as our website, and we'll be coming back in weeks to come with more Catch Up with Chuck, meeting with people, looking at places, talking about success stories in rural America, and demonstrating that strong rural communities are a legitimate best choice for worthwhile living. Thanks so much for joining us.